Hey, welcome in. Tonight we're stepping into the Vatican, not the one of postcards and pilgrimages, but the one hidden behind locked doors and whispered prayers. For centuries, the Church claimed to shepherd souls, but in its shadows, there were missions, secrets, and sometimes silence enforced at knife point. This isn't a tale of saints and sermons. It's a story of quiet threats, vanished names, and the unseen hands that shaped power from the pews to the papal throne. If you find these stories of history's darker corners compelling, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy where these nights take us. And let me know down in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see the small constellation of lights glowing across the world as we explore together. Now dim the lights, let the fan hum, and lean into the quiet. This story begins in silence and ends with a question no one ever dared ask out loud. Throughout history, the papacy has often been framed as a beacon of morality, a shepherd guiding the faithful through the perils of a fallen world. But beneath the vestments and ritual lies another tradition, rarely spoken and never officially acknowledged, a legacy of control, secrecy, and sometimes calculated violence. The idea that the Vatican could orchestrate assassinations sounds more like fiction than fact. Yet, as we trace the arc of church history, patterns begin to emerge that suggest silence was often preserved not through prayer, but through fear. From the early medieval period through the Renaissance and beyond, there are instances where those who challenged papal authority disappeared, died mysteriously, or were condemned in trials held behind closed doors. The Vatican never had a formal assassination order, at least not one that history has recorded openly. But its power, both spiritual and political, rested on more than just scripture. It was enforced by networks of loyal agents, informants, and inquisitors who operated in the shadows, some willing to kill if it meant protecting the sanctity of the papal throne. This wasn't unique to one era. During the Avignon Papacy in the 14th century, during the Borgia reign at the turn of the 16th century, even during the world wars of the 20th century, the Church engaged in secret dealings with political regimes, made quiet pacts, and silenced critics in ways that have never been fully explained. In Rome, where every brick bears witness to centuries of power, it is the silences that speak loudest. The corridors of the Vatican have long echoed with chants, footsteps, and sometimes screams muffled before they could be heard. Assassins may never have worn mitres or carried rosaries, but they walked the same halls, served the same masters, and vanished just as surely as the records that might have revealed their names. Whether by poison, dagger, or whispered decree, the papacy has always known that a threat to its authority was a threat worth eliminating. And history, when read between the lines, suggests it often did. In the late 9th century, Pope John VIII became one of the earliest known victims of assassination within the papal office, and his death has lingered in historical accounts with more questions than answers. He reigned from 872 to 882, a turbulent decade marked by political instability, external threats from Muslim raiders in southern Italy, and a growing rift between the papacy and the Frankish Empire. John VIII was a reformer, fiercely dedicated to defending Christian lands and asserting the Church's independence from imperial interference. But his determination came at a cost. He alienated powerful factions within the Roman aristocracy and the clergy including his own curia. According to the Liber Pontificalis and several chroniclers of the time, John VIII was first poisoned by members of his inner circle. When the poison failed to kill him quickly, he was bludgeoned to death, some say, with a hammer-bee his own attendants. This was not a random act of violence. It was a message. The papal crown did not protect him, and divine authority did not shield him from betrayal. There was no trial, no investigation, no punishment. His death was recorded, mourned in writing, and then life in Rome moved on. The Vatican did not collapse. The Curia did not protest. The machine simply continued. That silence is what speaks volumes. Murder from within the church hierarchy was not treated as a scandalette, was absorbed as political necessity. Historians have since debated whether John's assassination was driven by theological differences, personal grievances, or geopolitical maneuvering, but the method remains undeniable. Poisoning was an intimate crime, requiring access and trust. Bludgeoning suggested urgency, a need to finish what had been started. In both, there is calculation. It is in these moments that we glimpse a church willing to do whatever was needed to maintain stability, even if that meant shedding holy blood. The killing of Pope John VIII was not the last time death served the Vatican's interests. It was simply one of the earliest signs that murder, when framed as preservation, could be sanctified without ever being spoken aloud. By the 12th century, the Vatican had become more than a spiritual nucleus. It was a sovereign power with wealth, land, and enemy sand in that political world. Eliminating threats was not only practical, it was often seen as righteous. One of the most striking cases of church-sanctioned violence cloaked in divine language was the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1170. Though technically outside papal jurisdiction, the event exposed how sacred office could become a death sentence when power was at stake. Becket, once a close ally of King Henry II of England, became an obstacle after defending the independence of church authority from royal encroachment. Henry, frustrated and humiliated, is said to have exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took those words as command. They rode to Canterbury and butchered Becket at the altar of his own cathedral, his blood mixing with candle wax on the stone floor. The Pope at the time, Alexander III, condemned the act, but only after weighing its political consequences. Henry II was publicly shamed, but never excommunicated. He performed penance in public, and the matter was closed. This episode revealed something deeper than royal impetuosity. It exposed the Church's selective outrage, its ability to absorb political murder into ritual, turning scandal into theater. While Alexander III eventually canonized Becket as a martyr, there was no retaliation against those who had carried out the killing. In fact, some accounts suggest the Pope had been frustrated with Becket's stubbornness as well, though he would never admit it publicly. In such cases, the Church mastered the art of spiritual laundering, allowing bloodshed to occur by proxy, then cleaning it with absolution and sainthood. Assassination, in this context, did not oppose faith. It served it, and for centuries to come, the lesson remained. If violence preserved the sanctity of papal influence, then repentance could follow, but the deed, once done, would never be undone. The notion that popes and bishops might send agents to kill feels incompatible with modern views of the Church, yet throughout the Middle Ages, the distinction between political necessity and divine mission was frequently erased. As the papacy evolved into a Central European power, rivalries between noble families, kingdoms, and church factions often ended not with councils, but with funerals. By the time of Pope Innocent IV, who reigned from 1243 to 1254, the machinery of suppression had become institutional. Innocent authorized the expansion of the Papal Inquisition, a system designed not only to root out heresy, but to crush political dissent masquerading as spiritual error. While most think of the Inquisition as a courtroom with trials and torture, what happened behind closed doors often bypassed procedure. Inquisitors traveled with guards, seized property, and in more than a few cases, people simply disappeared. Not everyone was burned in the square. Some never made it that far. Monasteries served as prisons, and orders were delivered under vows of secrecy. Papal legates acted with sweeping authority, and if a local priest or landowner resisted church power, they were removed, sometimes quietly, sometimes permanently. The church did not record these as assassinations. They were called corrections, necessary actions to preserve unity and obedience. One Dominican chronicler from the late 13th century described an execution of divine will that took place in Lombardy, where a heretical abbot was silenced by the hand of a just man. No trial, no burial. Only the phrase, "Justice has been served." These stories are not isolated. Across medieval Europe, from the Pyrenees to Bohemia, the Church's grip was enforced not just with scripture, but with shadow. Faith required obedience. And disobedience, when it threatened the papal crown, was met not with mercy, but with elimination. Not every assassin wore armor. Some wore robes, and some carried the cross in one hand and a dagger in the other. Few institutions in the world have demanded more vulnerability than the Catholic confessional. It is a space built on trust, on the idea that one can speak their sins into the darkness and receive forgiveness without fear. But what happens when that sacred privacy becomes a tool not of mercy, but of manipulation? By the height of the medieval church's power in the 13th and 14th centuries, the confessional was not only a sacrament, it was a source of intelligence. In a time when few could read, and fewer still could speak openly without consequence, the confession booth became a place where secrets flowed freely. Bishops, inquisitors, and even popes began to understand that information shared in penance could be turned to advantage. While canon law forbade priests from breaking the seal of confession, loopholes appeared in practice. Some confessions were shared among higher clergy for spiritual consultation. Others were used indirectly, influencing papal decisions or inquisitorial priorities without ever naming names. During the Inquisition, confessors were occasionally instructed to probe for signs of heresy, political disloyalty, or conspiracy under the guise of spiritual care. In Spain, by the late 15th century, the confessional was sometimes weaponized to extract information about Jews who had converted to Christianity, but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faith. Known as conversos, these individuals were frequently investigated not based on public behavior, but based on whispers from confessionals. Even outside of formal trials, local priests could discreetly inform higher authorities of sentiments deemed dangerous to the church. Those confessions were not read aloud, but they were remembered and sometimes acted upon. The line between spiritual guidance and espionage blurred until, in many cases, it ceased to exist. The confessional was never intended as a trap, but for those watching the boundaries of doctrine and dissent, it became a tool more powerful than any blade. A man may lock his door, hide his papers, and guard his thoughts, but in a moment of guilt, he would kneel, confess, and give away everything, all in the name of God. In the year 799, Pope Leo III was dragged from his horse in the streets of Rome, beaten nearly to death by his enemies, and left bloodied and half-blind. His attacker supporters of the previous Pope Hadrian, I accused him of perjury and adultery. But beneath those charges lay a deeper motive: political control. Rome was divided between factions loyal to different noble families, and Leo had not come from Rome's traditional aristocracy. His election had been unpopular with powerful Roman elites, and they wanted him removed. His blinding and attempted mutilation were designed not just to punish, but to render him permanently unfit for office. In Byzantine tradition, physical deformity disqualified a man from leadership. But Leo survived, escaped his captors, and fled to the court of Charlemagne in Paderborn. There, he found not only sanctuary, but a savior. Charlemagne marched into Rome the following year and restored Leo to the papal throne. On Christmas Day, 800, Leo crowned Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor inside St. Peter's Basilica, forging a new alliance that would define Western Christendom for centuries. But Leo did not forget. After his return to power, he summoned a synod in Rome to investigate his attackers. Though the council officially absolved him of the charges, no serious inquiry was held into the motivations behind the assault. Leo used the moment to eliminate his enemies. Those involved in the attack were captured, imprisoned, and likely executed or exiled. Official records are sparse, but contemporary chroniclers note that Leo took measures to cleanse the city of those who betrayed him. While it may not have been an official assassination in the modern sense, it was political revenge cloaked in the language of justice. Leo had been brutalized. When he returned, he made sure no one would try again. His alliance with Charlemagne became a cornerstone of papal authority. But it was forged not only in ritual and empire, but in the blood of those who had dared to challenge the man who wore the keys of St. Peter. Pope John VIII, who reigned from 872 to 882, faced an empire in disarray, a church divided by politics, and an external world pressing in with violence and corruption. His decade on the papal throne was defined by desperate diplomacy, fragile alliances, and a series of military failures that eroded his authority both within Rome and beyond. Most notably, John VIII struggled to organize a defense against Saracen raiders, who had established footholds in southern Italy. He called for Christian unity, offering aid to embattled cities and pleading with Frankish rulers to support a broader campaign. But his pleas often went unanswered, and his willingness to make concessions pay tributes, and cut deals with Muslim forces angered many of his own supporters. Inside the city, Roman nobility grew restless. The papacy had always walked a careful line between spiritual leadership and temporal survival, and John's inability to stabilize the political and military situation turned former allies into conspirators. According to the Annales Fuldenses and several other early sources, John VIII became the first pope in history to be assassinated. The accounts agree on the essentials. He was poisoned first, and when the poison worked too slowly, his skull was crushed by a blow to the head, possibly from a hammer or club. His killers were almost certainly from within his own entourage, members of the Curia or Roman aristocracy who saw his leadership as a liability. The Vatican did not launch an investigation. No arrests were made. The Church moved quickly to install a new pontiff, and the details of John's murder were quietly folded into the annals of papal succession. His death revealed a bitter truth about the papacy in the 9th century. It was not simply a spiritual office, but a throne balanced precariously on political fault lines. When those lines shifted, loyalty gave way to silence, and the shepherd of Rome could be cast aside by those sworn to serve him. John VIII's end was not martyrdom. It was a warning one the Church never formally acknowledged, but never forgot. Bonizo of Sutri was not a pope, but his story exposes the lethal undercurrents that flowed just beneath the surface of ecclesiastical power in the 11th century. Born around 1045, Bonizo was an Italian bishop and reformer deeply aligned with the Gregorian Reformansan ambitious movement to cleanse the Church of corruption, enforce clerical celibacy, and reclaim papal authority from secular rulers. Bonizo was outspoken, intelligent, and bold enough to challenge both nobles and bishops alike, especially those accused of simonethe buying and selling of church offices. He served as Bishop of Piacenza and later Cremona, where his sermons denounced the entanglement of the Church with worldly power. That boldness made him enemies, both in the secular courts and among clergy who preferred the status quo. By the 1080s, Bonizo had become closely associated with Pope Gregory VII and later Urban II, both of whom sought to solidify papal independence during the investiture controversy. The battle over whether popes or kings could appoint bishops. For a time, Bonizo was sheltered by papal authority. But once that protection waned, he was exposed. In 1090, while serving in Piacenza, he was seized by an angry mob, aligned with the local nobilitissime, say, with tacit church approval. He was dragged from his home, mutilated, and thrown from a tower to his death. Officially, his murder was written off as the result of political chaos, a reaction to unpopular reforms. But the precision of the attack, the lack of papal retaliation, and the cold silence that followed suggest more than random violence. Bonizo had become a liability. His death removed a dangerous voice at a time when the Church was struggling to maintain cohesion in a fractured Italy. He had once served the popes, but when it became clear that his zeal no longer served their survival, the silence that fell over his murder spoke louder than any proclamation. The Church did not need to send a dagger when it could simply turn away and let others do the killing. In that sense, Bonizo became an early victim of Rome's most powerful weapon, omission. In the closing years of the 10th century, Rome was no stranger to violent power struggles, and Crescentius the Younger stood at the center of one of its bloodiest chapters. A Roman noble from the powerful Crescentii family, he had already played a significant role in papal politics during the reigns of Benedict VII and John XV. When Pope Gregory V, a German and the first pope appointed by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, ascended to the throne in 996, Crescentius saw an opportunity to reclaim Roman control over the papacy. The resentment against a foreign pontiff ran deep among Roman aristocrats, and Crescentius capitalized on it. In 997, he led a coup that forced Gregory V out of the city and installed an anti-pope, John XVI, with support from Byzantine sympathizers. For nearly a year, Crescentius ruled Rome as its de facto secular overlord, controlling the papal palace and dictating church policy. But his moment of power was short-lived. In 998, Otto III returned to Rome with an imperial army and reinstated Gregory V. What followed was not diplomacy, it was vengeance. Crescentius fled to Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress that had long served as Rome's last refuge for the doomed. When imperial troops breached the walls, Crescentius was captured and publicly executed, beheaded on the emperor's orders. His body was displayed as a warning. The antipope, John XVI, was treated even more cruelly. Mutilated and paraded through the streets, he survived only by the intervention of Otto's grandmother. Pope Gregory V made no move to stop the executions. In fact, church records praise the act as necessary to restore divine order. The line between ecclesiastical justice and political assassination disappeared in the spectacle. Crescentius had attempted to control the papacy. In response, the Pope and the Emperor collaborated in his annihilation. This was not merely about removing a rival. It was about extinguishing a bloodline, a legacy, a challenge to papal sovereignty, and it was done not with sacred writ, but with a sword. In this moment, the Vatican did not turn the other cheek. It drew the blade. Gerbert of Aurillac was no ordinary monk. Born around 946 in the region of Auvergne in France, he rose from humble beginnings to become one of the most intellectually gifted men of his age. He studied in Catalonia and became fluent in Arabic mathematical and astronomical texts, importing Islamic scientific knowledge into Western Europe centuries before it would become widespread. His intellect gained him powerful allies, including Emperor Otto II and later Otto III, and in the year 999, he was elevated to the papacy as Pope Sylvester II. His appointment was seen as a triumph of reason and scholarship, a rare moment when knowledge and power were united at the highest level of the Church. But brilliance in an age of ignorance could be dangerous. Rumors quickly spread that Gerbert had learned his secrets through sorcery, that he had studied in Moorish lands not as a scholar but as a necromancer, and that he had made a pact with the devil to ascend the papal throne. These were more than idle whispers. They were weaponized by his political enemies, particularly those within the Roman clergy, who resented both his foreign origin and his close alliance with the German emperor. His papacy lasted only 4 years, and though he sought to reform the Church, strengthen imperial ties, and promote learning, he was met with resistance at every turn. When he died in 1003, legends quickly filled the void. One tale claimed his tomb would sweat before the death of any pope. Another said his heart burst in fear after hearing his death prophesied by a demonic voice. The Church never condemned these stories, nor did it attempt to clear his name. In silence, it allowed the rumors to stand, perhaps to ensure that no future pope would lean too heavily on reason or stray too far from orthodoxy. Whether Sylvester II was poisoned or died naturally is still debated. But what endures is the image of a man too brilliant for his own time, destroyed not by devils, but by the fearful men who invoked them. Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century, was meant to be a sanctuary of order, silence, and prayer. Perched high in the mountains of southern Italy, it became the cradle of Western monasticism and a symbol of peace amid the chaos of the early Middle Ages. But by the 10th and 11th centuries, this fortress-like monastery was not only a spiritual centret, was a political stronghold with vast land holdings, military alliances, and significant influence over papal appointments. The monks of Monte Cassino were not cloistered in ignorance. They were literate, trained, and in many cases seasoned in political maneuvering. As the church's power grew, so did the stakes, and the abbots of Monte Cassino were known to send messengers, not all of them carrying scripture. Chroniclers from the time record suspicious deaths of rival clerics, bishops who vanished after disputing Monte Cassino's land claims, and even attacks on nearby villages that resisted monastic control. While these accounts are vague, one in particular, from the Chronicon Cassinense, describes an incident in which a high-ranking local noble died suddenly after a meeting with the abbot. No war was declared. No feud followed. The abbot later appeared in Rome, with new charters signed and sealed. It's not difficult to read between the lines. Monte Cassino maintained a disciplined structure, trained its own men, and had access to poison, weapons, and the silence of its walls. Papal authorities never questioned the monastery's methods. In fact, popes often protected its autonomy, even when complaints surfaced about its heavy-handed dealings. It is within this veil of spiritual authority that violence found cover. The Benedictine rule calls for stability, obedience, and silence, but silence, in this case, may have concealed far more than humility. When the goals of the church aligned with the ambitions of the abbey, there was no need to question how order was preserved. Monte Cassino's monks may not have been called assassins, but their hands did more than pray, and their loyalty served not only God, but Rome. When Pope Clement V relocated the papal court to Avignon in 1309, he did more than move the seat of power. They transformed the church into something darker, more centralized, and infinitely more secretive. What began as a response to unrest in Rome soon evolved into nearly 70 years of papal exile, during which 7 popes reigned not from the Eternal City, but from a walled palace on the banks of the Rhone River. This period, now known as the Avignon Papacy, was marked by extraordinary administrative control, the expansion of church bureaucracy, and the quiet rise of a shadow network tasked with maintaining that control. The Black Cloaks, as they came to be known in whispers, were not an official order. There are no surviving records of their names or functions. But letters from the period, particularly those from Italian envoys and dissatisfied cardinals, speak of masked men summoned at night, of informants who vanished after speaking against the papal court, and of poisonings passed off as divine judgment. The Avignon popes relied heavily on the newly empowered apostolic camera, the financial and administrative arm of the papacy, to enforce edicts and silence resistance. Within that apparatus, it appears, was a group of trusted agentsmen whose loyalty was not to Scripture, but to secrecy. The Black Cloaks wore no insignia, answered only to the highest levels of the Curia, and were rumored to operate across borders, eliminating threats and enforcing papal will with methods unbecoming of Christ's vicar. One 14th-century Florentine merchant, writing anonymously, referred to them as the Pope's breath in the dark felt, but never seen. When Pope Gregory XI finally returned the papacy to Rome in 1377, the agents of Avignon did not vanish. Some were absorbed into the College of Cardinals. Others simply disappeared, their work complete, their records expunged. The Black Cloaks became legend, but in a church where power must often be protected without leaving fingerprints, legend can be a kind of truth. In Avignon, the papacy refined the art of quiet force, and its tools wore velvet, not armor. Girolamo Savonarola was not an assassin, but his death bears all the marks of one ordered from above, swift, symbolic, and devastatingly public. Born in Ferrara in 1452, Savonarola was a Dominican friar whose sermons in Florence during the late 15th century thundered against the moral corruption of the Church, the Medici family, and, most dangerously, the papacy itself. By the early 1490s, after the Medici had been expelled from Florence, Savonarola became the de facto spiritual ruler of the city. His fiery calls for repentance, modesty, and civic purity culminated in the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities in 1497, where mirrors, jewelry, secular books, and even paintings were burned in Piazza della Signoria at his urging. But his greatest heresy in the eyes of Rome was not his Puritanism, it was his open challenge to Pope Alexander VI. Savonarola refused to acknowledge the authority of a pope he called corrupt, immoral, and unworthy of Peter's throne. Alexander VI of the Borgia family was a man not easily defied. He offered Savonarola a cardinal's hat if he would stop preaching. The friar refused. In return, the Pope excommunicated him and demanded Florence silence him. Eventually, under pressure from both internal factions and papal influence, the Florentine government turned on him. He was arrested, tortured, and forced to confess to visions and prophecies he never made. Then, on May 23, 1498, he was hanged and burned in the same square where he had once preached repentance. The execution was carried out with meticulous theatricality, overseen by city officials, but watched carefully by papal envoys. His ashes were scattered in the Arno River so no relics would remain. Pope Alexander VI never admitted involvement, but he did not have to. The message was clear. No one, not even a man revered by thousands, could publicly challenge papal authority and survive. Savonarola died as a warning. His body consumed by fire, his name nearly erased until memory brought him back. In the struggle between conscience and control, Rome had chosen control, and the cost was a prophet, silenced forever. Pedro Martinez de Luna, known to history as Antipope Benedict XIII, was a man who refused to step down, even when the world had moved on. Born in 1328 in the Kingdom of Aragon, he rose through the ranks of the Church and was elected Pope in 1394 not in Rome, but in Avignon during the chaos of the Western Schism. For nearly 4 decades, Christendom was divided between rival popes, each claiming legitimacy. Benedict XIII held firm in Avignon long after the Roman line was recognized by most of Europe. While other claimants resigned or were removed, he refused, insisting that he alone was the true successor of Peter. Even after the Council of Constance in 1417 officially ended the schism by electing Martin V, Benedict declared the council invalid and continued to rule from the fortress at Peñascola in Spain. At first, he still had powerful allies, Scotland, parts of Spain, and a handful of theologians. But one by one, his support eroded. Eventually, he was abandoned even by his own cardinals. Then, something strange happened. Records become vague, letters stop, and by the early 1420s, Benedict XIII effectively vanishes from the political world. Officially, he died in 1423, aged nearly 95, but the circumstances of his final years are shrouded in silence. No grand funeral, no public renunciation. His few remaining followers claimed he appointed 4 secret cardinals before his death to ensure the continuity of his line. But no evidence of those appointments survives. It is as if he disappeared into the stone walls of Peñascola, taking his claim and legacy with him. Rumors spread some said he had been poisoned to prevent further division. Others claimed the Church quietly funded his isolation in exchange for his silence. The Vatican never investigated. It had no reason to. Benedict's removal served unity, and unity required forgetting. The last antipope of Avignon faded into obscurity not by decree, but by deliberate neglect. A man once powerful enough to split Christendom ended his days unacknowledged, erased not by force but by silence. In the early 16th century, as Europe fractured under the weight of the Reformation and rival kingdoms maneuvered for dominance, the Vatican found itself fighting a war of shadows as much as sacraments. While sermons were preached and bulls were issued, much of the real struggle took place in the quiet corridors of diplomacy and espionage. The Papacy, especially under Pope Leo X and later Clement VII, maintained a vast network of informants, envoys, and agents embedded across the courts of Europe. These men were often scholars or priests sent under the guise of theological missions, but in truth, many were tasked with gathering intelligence, disrupting enemy alliances, and when needed removing threats before they could gather force. One such figure, known to history only by fragments of Vatican correspondence, was dispatched in 1526 to the court of Francis I of France. His mission: assess the loyalty of French bishops sympathetic to Luther's cause, and report any subversive activity directly to Rome. Fluent in Latin and French, trained in canon law, he was the perfect operative anonymous, obedient, and utterly forgettable. For several months, letters arrived in Rome detailing conversations behind cathedral doors, the quiet spread of reformist texts, and warnings of a planned alliance between certain cardinals and the French king. Then the letters stopped. No final message. No remains returned. No ransom demanded. The agent was never seen again. His fate remains undocumented, but Vatican notes in the Archivio Segreto indicate a quiet payout to his surviving relatives on act, rarely undertaken unless death was confirmed or ordered. Was he discovered and executed? Silenced by those he spied upon? Or sacrificed by Rome itself to maintain deniability? The Curia never acknowledged his work, and his name was scrubbed from the official travel rolls. What survives are hints, half-lines, and the echo of a life erased for the sake of institutional preservation. In the Church's long battle to protect its authority, not every soldier wore armor, and not every death left a body. Some were folded into silenced, appeared in service of the papal crown. Poison has long been the weapon of choice for those who seek silence without spectacle, and within the vast and layered history of the Catholic Church, Few tools were more effective at removing enemies while preserving appearances. By the Renaissance, the papal court had perfected discretion to a deadly art, and poison became a quiet fixture of its political arsenal. During the reigns of Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X, the walls of the Vatican concealed not only relics and saints, but formulas recipes for powders, tinctures, and oils capable of inducing death without suspicion. The Archivio Segreto Vaticano, the Vatican's private archive, contains oblique references to these substances in coded ledgers and correspondence. One such letter, attributed to Cesare Borgia Alexander VI's ruthless son, mentions a vial referred to only as the solution for unworthy flesh, believed by some historians to be cantharidin, a potent toxin derived from blister beetles. Another document from the early 16th century describes a slow-acting concoction meant to mirror the symptoms of plague, ensuring victims died in quarantine, far from questions or witnesses. The keepers of such poisons were often apothecaries housed within the papal palaces, men trained not only in healing but in discretion. They served under cardinal protectors, loyal to specific factions within the Curia. Deaths of cardinals, rival claimants, and inconvenient witnesses, especially during conclaves, were frequently ascribed to natural causes after only cursory examination. In 1555, Cardinal Giovanni Morone was imprisoned on suspicion of heresy, but later released after the sudden death of his primary accuser, Cardinal Michele Ghislieri's ally. No investigation followed. Rumors swirled, but the Church neither confirmed nor denied them. The art of assassination, when wrapped in divine ritual and bureaucratic decorum, left no stain. Within the papal court, poison was not murder, it was correction, executed in silence. And because the names were never written and the formulas kept hidden, the dead never received justice. They received a funeral. In the Vatican's long pursuit of purity and control, even death could be scripted with holy hands. In the fevered paranoia of post-Reformation Europe, few groups inspired as much admiration, suspicion, and fear as the Society of Jesus. Founded in 1540 by Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuits began as a tightly disciplined order, devoted to education, missionary work, and the spiritual defense of Catholicism during the Counter-Reformation. They quickly became the Church's intellectual elite, serving as confessors to kings, teachers in distant colonies, and advisors to popes. But as their influence expanded across continents and into royal courts, so too did the fear that they answered to no nation, only to Rome. It is from this fear that the legend of the Jesuit dagger emerged. The phrase first appeared in Protestant tracts in the late 16th century, accusing Jesuits of orchestrating political assassinations on behalf of the Vatican. The most infamous accusation involved the 1589 assassination of King Henry III of France by a Dominican monk, Jacques Clement. Though not a Jesuit, Clement's act fed the rumor that Catholic religious orders were carrying out targeted killings to eliminate Protestant rulers. The Jesuits denied involvement, but suspicion lingered. The English government, under Queen Elizabeth I, believed Jesuit priests in exile were plotting her death. The failed gunpowder plot of 1605, while led by Catholic laity, was often blamed unfairly on Jesuit influence. In truth, no definitive proof has ever surfaced linking the society to organized assassinations, but Jesuit secrecy and discipline lent the theory its staying power. Their training, their vow of obedience, and their access to the highest echelons of both church and state gave the impression of an elite corps with global reach. Jesuit schools taught rhetoric, ethics, and strategy. Jesuit missions operated in lands forbidden to outsiders. In the hands of their enemies, this made them spies and saboteurs. Whether the Jesuit dagger ever struck a target is unknown. But the idea that Rome had a spiritual order ready to kill for doctrine-shaped policy inflamed wars and stained the society with shadows it never fully escaped. Legend, in this case, may have done the work of steel-creating fear without ever drawing blood. Cola di Rienzo was not a pope, nor a priest, but his rise and fall offers a window into how the papacy has, at times, allowed assassination to serve its purpose without ever giving a command. Born in Rome in 1313 to humble origins, Cola was a brilliant orator and a fervent admirer of ancient Roman Republican ideals. In 1347, capitalizing on the absence of papal authority, Pope Clement VI was then in Avignon. Cola declared himself tribune of the Roman people and led a popular revolt against the corrupt Roman nobility. His early reforms were radical. He abolished noble privileges, restructured taxation, and attempted to revive a civic government modeled after ancient Rome. At first, even Clement VI welcomed his rise, seeing in him a man who might restore order in the Pope's name. But Cola's rhetoric soon shifted. He began speaking not of papal sovereignty, but of Rome's right to self-rule. His language elevated him to a near-messianic figure, and that made him dangerous not only to the aristocracy but to the Church. Clement VI excommunicated him before the end of the year. Cola fled, disgraced, and spent years in exile before being lured back to Rome in 1354 with vague promises of papal favor. Once back in the city, he was quickly isolated. His support eroded, his guards turned, and within months, a riot broke out in the Campidoglio. He was seized by a mob and stabbed to death in the streets, his body hung upside down for the public to mock. No papal bull ordered his death. No cardinal signed an edict. But the silence from Avignon was deafening. Clement VI never intervened. He never condemned the killing. By doing nothing, the papacy allowed its problem to solve itself. The message was unmistakable. Challenge the Church's authority, and Rome will swallow you whole. Cola di Rienzo believed in a Roman revival free from clerical domination. For that, he died with a sword in his side and the city's laughter in his ears. The Vatican need not have raised a hand, it only needed to wait. The popular image of the Inquisition conjures shadowed rooms, whispered accusations, and the slow grind of trials where belief itself was placed on the rack. But beyond the torture chambers and tribunal halls was another reality. The Inquisition operated with muscle, real muscle. Armed men, sanctioned by the Church, dispatched not to debate theology, but to enforce compliance with steel and fire. During the height of the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, with papal approval from Sixtus IV, inquisitors did not merely issue verdicts, they oversaw entire squads of armed enforcers. These groups, often drawn from local militias or mercenary circles, worked under the authority of the Holy Office, but their loyalty was to the Inquisitor, not the Church at large. They raided homes, confiscated property, detained suspects, and sometimes executed summary justice when formal trials were inconvenient or politically dangerous. While the Inquisition publicly maintained a legalistic framework, these unofficial units often acted in the gray spaces between church law and royal decree. Inquisitors like Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor of Spain, maintained networks of informants and troops who carried out missions in secrecy. When the Inquisitor General ordered the arrest of entire Converso communities' Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of heresied, was these armed forces who kicked in doors and dragged men from their beds. And when resistance came, violence followed. Some records describe sudden disappearances of vocal critics, especially among the clergy who questioned the Inquisition's methods. These men did not face trials. They simply vanished. Their property was absorbed by the church or the crown. Their names were crossed from the rolls. There was no need for a papal death warrant. These actions were cloaked in righteous necessity, executed by men who claimed to wield God's justice. But the truth is simpler. The Inquisition needed control, and control required fear. For that, it had its own army and official, unacknowledged and very real. In the Holy Office, faith was guarded not only by Scripture, but by sword. In the high-stakes world of Renaissance church politics, few families wielded power as boldly or as dangerously as the Orsini. For generations they had controlled castles, commanded private armies, and placed cardinals into the heart of the Vatican. But none rose higher, fell harder than Cardinal Giovanni Battista Orsini. Born into privilege in 1450, Orsini was elevated to cardinal by Pope Sixtus IV, and soon became a master of ecclesiastical diplomacy. He was rich, deeply connected, and ruthlessly ambitious. By the time Alexander V. Rodrigo Borgia took the papal throne in 1492, Orsini was one of the few men in Rome who posed a serious challenge to Borgia authority. Tensions rose as the Borgias sought to consolidate power and wealth, and the Orsini refused to bend. In 1503, after years of behind-the-scenes rivalry, Orsini was arrested on vague charges of conspiracy against Pope Alexander VI. The arrest itself was shocking enough. No trial, no warning, but what followed was even more telling. While held in Castel Sant'Angelo, Orsini suddenly died. Officially, the cause was illness. Unofficially, it was poison. Reports from the time suggest he was interrogated harshly, possibly tortured, and denied basic care. His vast estates were immediately seized by the Papacy, enriching the Borgia family and weakening one of its last internal rivals. The Vatican never offered an inquiry or explanation. His properties were redistributed. His supporters were silenced or bought. Alexander VI and continued his reign with no visible remorse. It was a masterstroke of internal politics. Remove the threat, seize the assets, and control the narrative. No dagger in the dark, just a man in a cell, dead before sunrise. In a church that claimed divine moral authority, the quiet elimination of a powerful cardinal raised no public outcry. To challenge the papacy from within was to play a game without rules. Orsini lost, and Rome did what it always had: washed its hands and moved forward. Justice was not served. because justice was never on the table, only survival. Castel Sant'Angelo looms over the Tiber like a stone sentinel, its massive rotunda casting a long shadow across the heart of Rome. Originally built as Emperor Hadrian's mausoleum in the 2nd century, it was transformed over the centuries into a fortress, prison, papal residence, and repository of secrets. By the Renaissance, it had become the Vatican's most feared stronghold, not just because of its walls, but because of what happened behind them. When the papacy needed a place to keep someone quiet, Castel Sant'Angelo was the preferred destination. High-profile enemies of the Church, rebellious clergy, and political dissidents often entered its gates and were never seen again. While official records mention routine imprisonments, many deaths within the castle were never documented with clarity. Some were reported as illness. Others simply disappeared from the archives altogether. It is in this void that whispers of the Vatican's silent killers begin. These were not assassins in the traditional sense. They were guards, interrogators, confessorsmen with access to poison, to cells without sunlight, to methods of persuasion that left no visible wounds. Torture was used, yes, but more often it was deprivation, starvation, or a carefully timed dose of something slipped into wine or water. One account from the 16th century describes a cardinal who arrived healthy and articulate, only to be found dead a week later, his corpse too decomposed to examine. The castle had its own physicians, its own kitchens, and its own chapel. Every need of the prisoner could be met until silence became the need. Popes like Paul III and Sixtus V relied on the fortress to maintain order behind closed doors. What could not be silenced with doctrine could be erased with stone and time. Castel Sant'Angelo never had to speak. Its silence was louder than confession. Those who entered were not tried. They were managed. In Rome, it wasn't always the sword that did the killing. Sometimes it was the absence of light, the weight of history, and the quiet decision made in the papal chambers above. Few names in papal history evoke as much dread and fascination as that of Pope Alexander VI. Born Rodrigo Borgia in 1431, his papacy from 1492 to 1503 remains one of the most controversial in the entire history of the Church. Accused of simony, nepotism, and outright murder, Alexander has long been held up as the archetype of papal corruption. But beyond the politics and excesses of his reign lies a darker legend, that of a pope who sanctioned, if not ordered, assassinations in the shadows to secure his power and protect his family. The Borgia court was filled with intrigue. Ambassadors wrote of nightly visits, secret meetings, and sudden deaths. It was widely whispered that Cardinal Orsini, whose death we covered earlier, was poisoned on Alexander's orders. But he was not the only one. The mysterious deaths of rival cardinals, sudden illnesses among powerful nobles, and the quiet disappearances of papal critics created an atmosphere of terror around the Vatican. Much of this work was said to be orchestrated not by Alexander directly, but by his son Cesare Borgia, cardinal-turned-military commander, who was as brilliant as he was brutal. Cesare is believed to have maintained a corps of loyal agents and assassins, some drawn from the ranks of exiled soldiers, others disguised as clerics or servants. The infamous cantarella, a slow-acting poison allegedly used by the Borgias, became synonymous with silent papal murder. Banquets turned deadly, rival alliances dissolved after mysterious deaths, and no investigation ever reached the throne. The Church never officially acknowledged these allegations, and defenders of Alexander point to a lack of concrete evidence. But the stories remain too many, too consistent, too chilling. The black legend of Alexander VI is not just about sin. It is about fear, the kind that made powerful men watch their cups at dinner, the kind that made silence a form of survival. Whether myth or truth, the shadow he cast over the papacy lingered long after his death. In his Rome, salvation was for sale, and survival had a price. It was supposed to be a celebration, a gathering of cardinals, nobles, and trusted allies within the Vatican's private chambers. The year was 1503, and Pope Alexander VI, aging but still formidable, dined that night with his son Cesare Borgia and several key figures of the Roman court. What happened next has been the subject of speculation, scandal, and whispered conspiracy for centuries. According to various contemporary accounts, including one by the diplomat Johannes Berhard, something went terribly wrong during the feast. Multiple guests fell ill within hours. Alexander himself became violently sick and lingered in agony for several days before dying. Cesare Borgia also suffered a near-fatal illness, but eventually recovered. The explanation offered at the time was simple: malaria, allegedly contracted from the swampy areas near the Vatican in the heat of summer, but few believed it. Rome had long seen malaria, yet never had it struck so selectively, so suddenly, or so conveniently. Theories spread like fire through the curia. Some claimed the poison was intended for one of the guests, but was mistakenly consumed by the Pope himself. Others suggested Cesare had planned to eliminate a rival cardinal, but miscalculated the dosage. A more damning version posited that one of Alexander's enemies had finally struck a secret revenge for years of betrayal and murder. No formal investigation followed. Alexander's body decomposed rapidly and was buried in haste, his bloated corpse reportedly too large to fit the tomb. Witnesses said the body emitted a foul stench, reinforcing the belief that poison, not disease, had claimed the pontiff. The truth remains buried with him. What survives is the legend of the poisoned chalice, a final dinner turned deadly by ambition and mistrust. In the halls of the Vatican, where loyalty was paper-thin and betrayal a form of politics, it was never a question of if someone would die, but who and when. On that night, the weapon was not a blade or a dagger, but a goblet raised in feigned friendship. And for once, the man who drank did not survive. Pope Sixtus IV, born Francesco della Rovere in 1414, is remembered today for commissioning the Sistine Chapella masterpiece of Renaissance art and religious grandeur. But beneath that legacy of beauty lies a reign marked by conspiracies, executions, and a willingness to use blood to maintain control. Elected Pope in 1471, Sixtus IV quickly transformed the papacy into a familial enterprise, appointing numerous nephews as cardinals and rewarding allies with positions of power. Yet his most notorious political move came in 1478 with the Papacy conspiracy, a failed assassination plot that has haunted his reputation ever since. The target was Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence, whose growing influence threatened papal authority in central Italy. On Easter Sunday, during High Mass in Florence's cathedral, assassins struck. Lorenzo survived with wounds. His brother Giuliano was stabbed to death on the altar steps. While Sixtus never admitted involvement, evidence suggests he was at least complicit. The archbishop who participated in the plot had been appointed by the Pope, and several of the conspirators had strong Vatican ties. When the plan failed, Florence retaliated. Conspirators were hanged from the Palazzo della Signoria, including clergy. Sixtus responded with fury, excommunicating Lorenzo and placing the city under interdicta spiritual punishment that suspended sacraments and religious rites. For the Pope, it was not about justice, but dominance. If Florence would not bend through diplomacy, then it would suffer spiritually. Sixtus IV ruled with the understanding that papal power must be felt as much as believed. Executions, political blackmail, and shadow alliances became tools of his administration. His own nephews, particularly Girolamo Riario, carried out violent campaigns in his name. In Rome, dissenters disappeared, cardinals plotted in fear, and whispers of betrayal led to sudden deaths. While the Sistine Chapel rose above the city, the streets below ran red. The Renaissance was not only a rebirth of beauty, it was an age where power cloaked itself in piety and ruled through fear, and in Sixtus IV's Vatican that fear had a throne. In the tangled web of 15th century diplomacy, where the Christian West and the Muslim East collided with increasing urgency, the Vatican understood one truth with unsettling clarity. Knowledge was power, and secrets were currency. Nowhere was this more apparent than in its dealings with the Ottoman Empire. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Vatican recognized that brute force alone would not contain the power of the sultans. So it turned to a quieter form of resistance espionage. While official ambassadors were dispatched to Istanbul to manage diplomatic relations, the Church also sent other men polyglot clerics, merchants in disguise, and monks trained in intelligence. These operatives moved through the Ottoman court with practiced humility, gaining access to court records, troop movements, and even the private quarters of key officials. One such figure, now lost to history but referenced in fragmentary Vatican dispatches from 1480, was known only by the code name Brother Samuel, described as a Dominican friar, fluent in Arabic and Turkish. He operated under the guise of a theological envoy, but was in fact the eyes and ears of the papal curia. Reports attributed to him warned of Ottoman naval expansions, secret armament shipments to North Africa, and attempts to recruit Italian mercenaries. His dispatches were sent through neutral ports, disguised in layers of parchment and ink only decipherable by trained clerks. Then, one day, they stopped. Rome never confirmed his death, but the timing was ominous. That same year, Sultan Mehmed II intensified his campaigns in the Balkans and increased pressure on Venetian outpost actions the Vatican may have hoped to preempt. Whether Brother Samuel was discovered and executed, or simply eliminated to prevent further leaks, remains unknown. What is clear is that the papacy was willing to risk the lives of its own in the shadows of enemy courts. It believed in spiritual supremacy but practiced realpolitik. In a world defined by empire and faith, the man in the Ottoman court was not just a witness. He was a blade without a hilt, sharpened by secrecy, sent into the lion's den without promise of return. When Queen Isabella of England, also known as Isabella of Angoulême, died in 1246, her death was publicly mourned and ritually honored. But her story is not the one history suspects when it speaks of heresy and queens. To find a death that bore all the marks of a church-sanctioned elimination, one must look instead to Marguerite Porete and the martyrdom of her dangerous book, or to the fate of Joan of Navarre, accused of witchcraft during the fraught years of the late medieval church. But perhaps the most chilling example of papal involvement in a queen's fall comes from a figure who wasn't killed with blade or fire, but with silence. Queen Joan of Naples, also called Joanna I, was a ruler whose reign challenged both temporal power and papal authority. Crowned in 1343, she ruled the Kingdom of Naples during one of the most tumultuous periods in European history, including the early decades of the Black Death and violent shifts in church allegiance during the Avignon Papacy. Joanna's marriage, politics, and defiance of papal mandates made her both a political liability and a moral scapegoat. She supported the Clementine line in Avignon during the Western Schism, defying Pope Urban VI in Rome. Her endorsement was not merely symbolicit, threatened to legitimize the Avignon Papacy across southern Europe. In 1382, Urban VI responded not with theological argument, but with military might. He supported Charles of Durazzo, who invaded Naples and seized Joanna. No ecclesiastical trial followed. No formal excommunication was issued. Just capture, imprisonment, and a quiet execution. She was strangled in her private quarters, her death reported as politically necessary, and her body buried without ceremony. The papacy washed its hands. The church did not kill her, they claimed. But they blessed the man who did. In this, Joanna's end mirrors many who opposed the church's temporal power, abandoned to enemies, silenced by force, erased from holy narrative. The Vatican did not wield the rope. It merely opened the door. In the late 16th century, during the heat of the Counter-Reformation, a man known only as Father Giacomo arrived at the monastery of Santa Maria Sopra Minerva in Rome. Clad in the black robes of a Dominican, he was welcomed as a scholar and penitent, granted sanctuary by the Curia, and given charge over the confessional booths of the church. Yet behind the veil of prayer and sacrament, Giacomo was whispered to have a different passstone that never appeared in official records, but lived in the silence of those who knew to fear him. According to marginal notes found decades later in the suppressed archives of the Inquisition, Father Giacomo was once an agent of the Holy Officia man trained not to preach, but to eliminate. Fluent in multiple languages and trained in anatomy, he had reportedly traveled through France, Bohemia, and the Low Countries under papal orders to neutralize heretical leaders who could not be swayed by persuasion or penance. His targets were never tried. They simply vanished. His skill was silence. His absolution was anonymity. But something changed. At the height of his effectiveness, he withdrew from the field and requested permanent monastic isolation. Rome granted it without question. Why? No one could say. Some believed he had been marked by conscience. Others whispered that he had disobeyed a direct order and been granted sanctuary in exchange for silence. Inside the church, he served as confessor for decades. The irony was heavy. a man who had silenced others with death, now listened for hours as strangers unburdened their sins. He never spoke of his past. He left no writings, but when he died in 1611, a sealed box in his quarters held rosary beads stained with rust, a list of names never canonized, and a single note: "I did not kill for God. I killed for those who said they spoke for him." The church held a small funeral. No honors, no inquiry. He was buried among the nameless. His confessions, it seemed, ended with him. In the mountains of southern France, among the high stone fortresses of Languedoc, a faith once flourished that the Vatican would come to see as a deadly threat. The Cathars, also known as the Albigensians, were not merely heretics in the eyes of Rome. They were rebels who dared to redefine the nature of God, the material world, and the Church's authority. Their theology was dualistic. They believed the physical world was created by an evil force, and that only the spiritual realm belonged to God. In rejecting the sacraments, the crucifix, and even the authority of the Pope, they positioned themselves as a movement not just of belief, but of resistance. Pope Innocent III responded not with dialogue, but with force. In 1209, he launched the Albigensian Crusade, a brutal campaign that would last for decades, led by northern barons and papal legates. The sack of Béziers, where thousands were slaughtered, became infamous for the quote attributed to the papal legate Arnaud Amalric: "Kill them all. God will know his own." But even after cities were razed and lands were confiscated, Cathar belief endured in the hills and caves of the Pyrenees. It was here that the Vatican's war turned silent. After the crusade ended, the Inquisition was formally established in the region. It did not wear armor. It came cloaked in parchment and robes. Special inquisitors, many drawn from the Dominican order, were dispatched to root out surviving Cathar communities. They used spies, informants, and forced confessions to dismantle what remained. Villages were monitored. Children were questioned. Relatives were arrested to pressure the accused. In some cases, Cathar sympathizers simply disappeared. Their homes were seized. Their names struck from records. No public trial, no tomb, just silence. By 1321, with the burning of the last known Cathar bishop, Guillaume Bellibaste, the faith was officially extinguished. But the cost was staggering. Thousands dead, entire towns erased, and a century of fear woven into the landscape. The Vatican did not just defeat the Cathars. It buried them, mind and memory alike, beneath a silence that endures in stone. In the intricate political dance of Renaissance Italy, where city-states played at diplomacy with knives under their robes, few institutions were as feared or as misunderstood as the Council of Ten in Venice. Formed in 1310 after a failed coup against the Venetian Republic, the council was created to defend the state from internal threats. It soon became one of the most secretive and powerful intelligence bodies in Europe, operating in complete anonymity. What few outside the inner circles understood was that the Vatican had long maintained quiet influence within its ranks. While Venice and the Papal States often clashed over territory and trade, they shared one mutual interest: controlling heresy and suppressing dissent. Several popes, particularly during the 15th and early 16th centuries, maintained informants inside the council, some of whom allegedly influenced the approval of targeted eliminations. These weren't simply arrests, they were disappearances. The 10 had their own executioners, and many sentences were carried out without trial or announcement. Those deemed enemies of the stater of the faith might be seized in the night and found floating days later in the lagoon, throats slit, pockets filled with stones. One Venetian chronicler recorded that a priest who had delivered anti-papal sermons vanished after being summoned to the Doge's palace for a discussion. His body was never found. In another case, a papal diplomat who was secretly relaying sensitive information to the Florentine Republic was discovered dead on the steps of a convent, with no sign of struggle. The Council of 10 issued no statement, and the Vatican offered no mourning. These killings were not sanctioned on parchment, but arranged in whispers. Rome's hands remained clean. But behind the velvet gloves of ecclesiastical diplomacy, there was steel. The Papacy, though miles away, knew the power of proxy. By working through the machinery of Venetian secrecy, it could erase without accusation, punish without exposure, and silence without scandal. In a world where politics wore the mask of piety, the hit list was written in candlelight, executed by strangers, and remembered only by those wise enough never to speak of it. The papal conclave is, by design, one of the most secretive events in the Catholic world, a cloistered gathering where the College of Cardinals elects the next pope under a veil of ritual, silence, and divine solemnity. But for all its sacred symbolism, history suggests that behind those locked doors, politics often outweighs piety, and in at least one case, it may have cost a man his life. In the conclave of 1623, called after the death of Pope Gregory XV, the cardinals gathered within the Vatican walls to choose his successor. The favorite candidate was Maffeo Barberini, a politically savvy prelate with powerful backers. One of his primary opponents was Cardinal Giovanni Mellini, a seasoned statesman known for his deep connections across Europe and his open criticisms of the growing influence of certain Roman families, particularly the Barberini. On the third day of voting, Mellini was found in his cell, unconscious. He died hours later. The official cause was listed as apoplexy, a common catch-all for sudden death. But rumors spread quickly among the inner circle. Mellini had reportedly received a sealed document just the night before an anonymous letter, warning him not to speak against Barberini in the final ballots. That letter vanished. His personal servant disappeared. And the next morning, Maffeo Barberini was elected as Pope Urban VIII. The speed of the transition, the lack of inquiry into Mellini's death, and the sudden silence of his few remaining allies raised quiet alarms. Some cardinals insisted that he had suffered a stroke. Others admitted, privately, that they feared it was a warning that dissent, even among princes of the Church, could be fatal. Urban VIII would go on to consolidate power like few popes before him, elevating his family, commissioning grand monuments, and suppressing critics with ruthless efficiency. The conclave, meant to channel the will of the Holy Spirit, had instead become a chessboard where the wrong move could end not only a career, but a life. In that sacred silence, death did not need a sword, only timing and permission. In the shadowy corridors of early modern Europe, where confessional politics divided empires and suspicion cloaked every corridor of power, the Jesuit order emerged as both a beacon of Catholic education and a lightning rod for conspiracy. Among their ranks were missionaries, scholars, confessors to King Sand spies. One of the most mysterious among them was Father Matteo Ricci's lesser-known contemporary, Father Ludovico Ferrante, a Jesuit operative dispatched not to China, but to the Protestant courts of northern Germany. Fluent in Latin, German, and French, Ferrante was a master of theological debate, but he also knew how to read ciphered letters, infiltrate Calvinist libraries, and report on anti-papal plots. By 1610, he had gained a quiet reputation as the Vatican's eyes in the heart of Lutheran Saxony. Then he vanished. Weeks later, his body was discovered near the outskirts of Dresden, propped upright in a stone garden alcove, frozen in a mask of agony, hands clasped in what looked like prayer. It was not a burial. It was a warning. No wounds were visible, but later observers suggested he had been poisoned, his body arranged to suggest piety while broadcasting fear. A folded letter was found beneath his sash, unsigned. It read, "Let the dead return to Rome and tell no tales." The message was unmistakable. Ferrante's death was not the work of common thieves. It was orchestrated with precision, ritual, and a cruel understanding of symbolism. The Vatican issued no statement. The Jesuits quietly withdrew from the region. His death was never investigated. To this day, no papal archive names him openly, but in a classified ledger from the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, there is a note. Agent LF silenced. Intelligence compromised. Send no replacement. The mask he wore in death was the final act of a mission lived in shadows. In the secret wars of faith and survival, not all martyrs wore crowns of thorns. Some wore black cassocks, carried false names, and died alone remembered only in silence. Tucked deep within the Umbrian hills, away from trade roads and papal fanfare, the monastery of San Leone once stood as a forgotten outpost of ecclesiastical retreat. Officially, it was founded in the early 13th century as a place for troubled clerics to find spiritual renewal in isolation. Unofficially, it became known by another name among certain members of the Curia, the Monastery of No Return. Records of its existence barely survived past the 1500s, yet papal correspondences mention it intermittently, never by name, only by allusion. It was described as a place where dangerous brothers found permanent silence, where dissonant voices were resolved, and where the tongue that defies the throne finds the stillness of stone. Monks who entered its walls under disciplinary orders were never reassigned. Bishops who fell from favor were sometimes invited to San Leone instead of facing a public trial. No memoirs, no letters, no clerical promotions ever emerged from its cloister. In fact, the Vatican archives contain more information about the building's supply shipments than the names of its residents. The final clue comes from a French envoy who traveled through the region in 1587 and recorded a chilling observation in his journal. There is a monastery in these hills the peasants refuse to approach. They say the bells ring without hands, and that no pilgrim who passes the gate is seen again. A few years later, the monastery burned. Whether it was accident, revolt, or intentional erasure is unknown. The Vatican made no comment. A document in the archives dated 1592 simply reads, "The matter of San Leone is concluded. Seal all ledgers. Today, only a crumbling foundation remains." Nature reclaimed its stone, and history buried its name. But for a brief time, it served as a mechanism of internal purification that required no trial, no edict, and no blood on parchment. Only walls, time, and silence. And for those sent there, the Church offered a final mercy. The disappearance was clean. No scandal, no grave, just absence. In the waning days of the Avignon Papacy, as Rome prepared to reclaim the Holy See, tensions simmered beneath the polished surface of church diplomacy. It was a time when the Papacy was still seated in southern France, from 1309 to 1377, nestled in the fortified palaces of Avignon. Among the many who rose to prominence during this turbulent era was Cardinal Etienne de Beaufort, brilliant theologian, a skilled negotiator, and, ultimately, a man who vanished without explanation. Born into nobility and educated in Paris, Beaufort was appointed cardinal in 1367 by Pope Urban V. He quickly became involved in delicate negotiations with the Holy Roman Empire and served as a liaison between Avignon and the restless clergy in Italy. But as the calls to return the papacy to Rome grew louder, Beaufort's loyalty to Avignon hardened. He warned that Rome was unstable, politically corrupt, and spiritually fragmented. This stance, while shared by many in the court, began to isolate him when Pope Gregory XI decided to relocate the papal seat back to Rome in 1377. Then, in early 1376, just months before the return, Beaufort failed to appear at a scheduled curial session. His attendants claimed he had gone on retreat. A week passed, then 2. The papal guard found his quarters undisturbed, his traveling robes untouched, and no record of departure in the city's gates. No witnesses, no letters, no message, just a void. The Pope ordered a discreet inquiry, but it produced no result. Some speculated that he had fled to England or the Rhineland under threat. Others believed he had been silenced for opposing the relocation to Rome. But a third theory quietly took hold among the cardinals, that he had been removed by the Church itself. Not by execution, but by erasure. No corpse was found, no funeral was held. His name faded from official lists within a year, and when the papacy returned to Rome, it did so without him. Whatever he had known, whatever he had threatened to say, was buried with his absence. In Avignon, silence had once been diplomacy. In Beaufort's case, it was likely a sentence. Beneath the grandeur of Vatican processions, beyond the glittering pageantry of holy days and public blessings, there exists a far quieter institution whose origins are as ceremonial as they are functional. The Pontifical Swiss Guard, established in 1506 under Pope Julius II, is known today for its vibrant Renaissance uniforms and stoic ceremonial presence. But hidden beneath its polished armor lies a deeper, less public history of covert obedience and silent enforcement. While the Guard's primary role was to protect the Pope, during certain eras it served an additional function, the quiet execution of papal will. Particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, During times of internal unrest and external threat, selected members of the Guard received sealed instructions known only to a handful within the Apostolic Palace. These black letters, as they were later referred to in recovered correspondence, were not official decrees. They bore no papal seal. They were verbal orders committed to memory, often involving surveillance, detainment, and in rare cases, removal. One account from 1614 describes a guard stationed outside the chambers of a cardinal, suspected of leaking confidential letters to Protestant envoys. The cardinal was never seen again. His belongings were quietly redistributed. Another letter from the early 1700s, written by a disillusioned guard to his brother in Lucerne, references a nighttime assignment involving the transfer of a theologian who had written privately against papal infallibility. No charges were filed, no trial was held. The man's room was emptied by dawn. These tasks were not discussed in the barracks. The chain of command bypassed normal officers and flowed directly from the papal household. The motto of the Swiss Guard, Acriter et fideliter, or with courage and loyalty, took on a new meaning in these moments. It did not only mean protecting the life of the pontiff, it meant preserving his silence, his secrets, and his control. Even today, the Guard's code of confidentiality remains among the strictest in the world. And while no modern pope has publicly invoked these darker traditions, the uniform still carries the weight of centurism embroidered in gold, others in shadow. The Apostolic Palace is a place of ceremony and grandeur, with its frescoed halls, private chapels, and gilded chambers, echoing centuries of sacred history. But just beyond the view of pilgrims and dignitaries lies a more practical corner of the Vatican papal kitchen. In the Renaissance and Baroque eras, this kitchen was not only a place of nourishment, it was a battleground of politics, jealousy, and in some whispered cases, quiet death. For centuries, the Pope's food was prepared under the supervision of trusted clerics and lay chefs, many of them sworn to secrecy. It was well understood that what passed through a pope's lips could determine the course of empires. During the 16th century, several pontiffs reportedly refused to eat anything that had not first been tested by their personal assaggiator food taster. The need was not paranoia, it was experience. In 1555, Pope Marcellus II died, just 22 days after his election. Though officially attributed to a stroke, some contemporary observers noted that he had complained of nausea following a private supper. No investigation was conducted. Others remembered Pope Clement VII, who died in 1534 after a prolonged illness. Again, rumors of poison circulated, especially given his enemies within the College of Cardinals and tensions with the Holy Roman Empire. The Vatican kitchen was often a battlefield of factions. Appointments to kitchen staff were closely guarded, and ingredients were often sourced only from trusted estates. Still, strange incidents continued. The sudden collapse of Cardinal Cornaro in 1603 after a banquet raised eyebrows, though no formal cause was announced. Some believe that the kitchens, despite precautions, were occasionally infiltrated. Spices, oils, and wine could carry more than flavor. A single drop of venom from a Sicilian herb or foreign tincture could produce symptoms resembling illness, acting slowly enough to cloud suspicion. Those who worked in the papal kitchens were often deeply devout, but also acutely aware that one misstep could kill a pope or unseat a dynasty. In the silence of polished silver and steaming pots, death could be served without a blade, only a spoon. He was only 12 years old, a golden-voiced soprano from the countryside of Lazio, selected to join the Vatican's revered Cappella Giuliate official choir of St. Peter's Basilica. It was 1586, and Rome pulsed with a mix of divine devotion and quiet menace. The choir boys lived and rehearsed within the apostolic palace itself, brushing shoulders with cardinals, papal secretaries, and even the Pope. Their voices soared through the domes of the basilica by day, and at night they returned to modest dormitories just beneath the splendor. But one boy, his name, lost to time, preserved only in a side note of a Benedictine monk's diary, witnessed something he should not have. According to that faded note, the boy overheard a heated exchange between two high-ranking members of the Curia in the sacristy, one accusing the other of embezzlement and betrayal. Names were named. A plot was mentioned. The boy, hidden behind a curtain, froze. He said nothing. But days later, during rehearsal, he collapsed. He did not speak. He could not sing. By the end of the week, he had vanished from the choir's rolls. His absence was explained as illness. Another boy was promoted in his place. Yet the monk, who served as confessor to the choir, suspected otherwise. He later recorded that the child had come to him in tears, terrified, and that after making a frightened confession was taken away by men in dark cloth bearing no crest. There was no funeral, no notice to the boy's family, and no inquiry. The Vatican offered prayers for a departed soul, but no name was mentioned at Mass. In a world where even the youngest could be a liability, innocence offered no protection. The boy had not challenged the Church. He had not raised his voice in protest. He had simply listened, and the Vatican, steeped in secrecy, could not risk an echo. His voice, once praised by cardinals, became a silence Rome never acknowledged. But some still say his song never truly stopped it, just moved from choir to caution, a soft, eternal note warning others to never listen too closely. In the spring of 1728, Rome was gripped by a strange hush. A prominent member of the College of Cardinals, Giuliano Conti, failed to appear at morning Massa service he never missed. At first, his absence was shrugged off. He was elderly, perhaps unwell. But as the hours passed and his chambers remained untouched, unease turned to alarm. By nightfall, the whispers had begun. Conti was no ordinary churchman. He had served as papal diplomat to Madrid, confessor to 2 previous popes, and was known for keeping detailed records detailed, some though-off internal Vatican proceedings. He had recently spoken out during a closed session about financial irregularities involving the Papal States and foreign gifts. The next day, his quarters were sealed by the Swiss Guard. No official statement was released. When reporters from L'Osservatore Romano inquired, they were told he had left Rome for spiritual retreat. But no carriage had been seen departing, no companion had been assigned, and no letter was left behind. What remained, curiously, was an open folio on his desk-blank parchment, save for one word, Traditus, delivered. Some speculated that Conti had uncovered something he should not have, perhaps involving secret deals with Austrian nobility or the Jesuit missions in South America. Others believed he had simply made too many enemies, and his removal was not a punishment but a warning. Years later, a monk from a remote Umbrian monastery confessed on his deathbed that a silent, guest-hooded, elderly, guarded, had been delivered one stormy night in 1728. He never spoke. He never left. He was buried without a name. The church never confirmed the story. No investigation was ever launched. Giuliano Conti was quietly removed from papal registries a year after his disappearance. To this day, his fate remains unrecorded, his legacy clipped at the root. Some say he died for truth. Others say he died because the church could not afford his truth. In the Vatican, even cardinals have no wings once they rise too high. In the mid-1600s, the Inquisition was not a memory, it was an institution. Its reach extended across Europe and into the colonies, its tribunals echoing with confessions pried from the mouths of heretics, apostates, and anyone unfortunate enough to be accused. At the center of this machinery stood men like Father Domenico Rinaldi, an inquisitor of Rome whose reputation was forged in fear. He was meticulous, eloquent, and utterly loyal to the Church's mission to purge corruption from within. But by 1659, Rinaldi himself stood accused. The charges were never made public. There was no arrest, no public denunciation, only a transfer. He was summoned quietly to a subterranean chamber beneath the Vatican, known only to a handful of Curia insiders as the Hall of Shadausa Place, reserved not for trials but for reckonings. According to a letter smuggled from a junior cleric, Rinaldi had begun investigating a group of high-ranking clergy who were allegedly profiting from forged indulgences and falsified penance records. What he found, if true, implicated members of the very college that had once praised him. The letter suggests that Rinaldi gathered evidence, intending to present it before the congregation of the doctrine of the faith. He never got the chance. Upon entering the chamber, he was reportedly confronted not by his peers, but by an archbishop sent on direct authority from the papal apartments. What happened next was never recorded. But Rinaldi was never seen again. His belongings were packed up and given to the Order of Silence, a monastic group charged with housing disgraced clergy. His name was struck from the inquisitorial rolls. His former secretary was reassigned to a monastery in Sardinia. The Vatican declared nothing, denied everything, and moved forward. Some say he was given the mercy of cloistered imprisonment. Others believe he was executed and buried beneath the basilica, entombed without epitaph. What remains is the echo of a man who sought to cleanse the church and found that even the purest zeal could not survive its secrets. In the end, the inquisitor became the accused, and the trial never left the room. In the grand history of the Church, papal bulls are often remembered as instruments of doctrine, tools of diplomacy, or declarations of divine mission. But not all were crafted in the spirit of peace. Some were sharpened like blades, their words forged into weapons. One such document, issued in 1487 by Pope Innocent VIII, would come to stain the Church with blood. Its name, Summis Desiderantes Affectibus. To many it was merely a reaffirmation of earlier edicts against witchcraft, but in practice it unleashed an unprecedented wave of sanctioned violence across Europe. The bull gave full authority to Inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprengermann, already notorious for their zealous persecution of suspected witches in Germany. With papal backing, They produced the Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, which combined theology, superstition, and fear into a manual of interrogation, torture, and execution. The Vatican did not officially endorse the book itself, but the bull lent it divine weight. It was cited again and again as justification for public burnings, drownings, and mutilations across the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. Thousands, mostly women, were accused, tried without mercy, and slaughtered under the banner of spiritual purification. Entire villages were emptied. Midwives, widows, and healers were dragged from their homes and tortured until they confessed to impossible crimes. And when their screams reached Rome, the Church responded not with revocation, but with silence. It took centuries before the Vatican began to distance itself from this legacy. Even then, no formal apology was ever issued for the bull that turned suspicion into execution. The document remains in the archives, its Latin script clean and unrepentant. To read it today is to glimpse the terrifying power of belief when wielded without mercy. It is a reminder that even sacred ink can command profane acts, and that sometimes the most dangerous orders are those that come signed not by kings, but by popes. In 1487, the Vatican didn't swing the axe, but it handed out the blades. Beneath the gold-trimmed vestments, beneath the jeweled rings and the soaring cathedrals, there existed a different kind of church. Not the one sung about in hymns or painted in frescoes, but a subterranean network, quiet, loyal, and deeply embedded. By the 17th century, the Vatican had grown into not just a religious authority, but a geopolitical power, with eyes and ears in every major court from Madrid to Warsaw. While nuncios and cardinals represented the visible hierarchy, a separate infrastructure emerged beneath them, answering not to the college but to the Pope himself. This was the Reticuli Obscuri, or the Shadow Nita term that survives only in fragments of private Vatican correspondence and redacted ledgers from the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. This network was composed of laymen and clergy alike, confessors in royal courts, abbots in remote monasteries, even merchants and librarians who served as informants. Their task was not conversion. It was control. They tracked heretical literature, intercepted letters, and reported on suspicious gatherings. In some cases, they arranged disappearances. No uniforms, no oaths, just allegiance. According to a secret 1,711 memorandum addressed to Pope Clement XI, the network had successfully neutralized 4 threats to doctrinal unity in the German principalities and subverted Protestant pamphlet production in Prague. No names were listed, just results. One Jesuit archivist, who later defected to Venice and published under a pseudonym, claimed the network operated like an underground court with whispered trials, hidden cells, and operatives authorized to act in defense of the keys of Peter. The Church denied his writings, burned his book, and excommunicated him in absentia. But too many of his details matched those found in sealed letters recovered decades later. The truth is, this clandestine arm of the Church rarely left evidence. Its greatest strength was not force, but invisibility. It did not act in the name of God, but in defense of his chosen institution. And in that defense, it allowed itself to become what it feared most, a silent power, unchecked and unaccountable. Not all wars are fought in the light, and not all faith wears white. In the pantheon of saints, there are martyrs, mystics, scholars, and reformers. But there is one figure whose past, shrouded in speculation and silence, suggests a darker path to canonization. His name was San Bellator, Latin for the warrior. Officially canonized in 1722 by Pope Innocent XIII, Bellator was venerated as a 16th century soldier who renounced violence, converted to the faith, and performed acts of humble piety until his death in a Roman monastery. His relics were enshrined, his name entered into the liturgical calendar, and pilgrims knelt before his image as a symbol of spiritual transformation. But a series of uncovered letters, buried deep within the Vatican's secret archives and declassified in the early 20th century, paints a far more complicated portrait. Bellator's real name was never recorded in the canonization documents. Prior to entering monastic life, he served in the personal retinue of Cardinal Alessandro Farnese era, when the line between ecclesiastical service and political intrigue was perilously thin. A note from 1589, penned by a Farnese aide, refers to a brother of the blade who had carried out duties beyond the moral burden of lesser men. One cryptic ledger entry lists travel stipends issued to Bellator during the deaths of 2 papal critics in separate cities, both of whom died under mysterious circumstances. His monastic records, though preserved, are sparse on details before his final vows. Some historians now believe that before taking the cloth, Bellator may have been part of an elite group of lay enforcer agents of the Church who operated beyond the written law. If true, then sainthood was not bestowed in ignorance, but perhaps in gratitude. A final reward, cloaked in incense and marble, for a life lived in the margins of divine justice. The Church has never reopened his cause. His feast day remains on the calendar, and pilgrims still pray at his tomb, unaware that the man they call saint may once have ended lives at the whispered request of Rome. Redemption, it seems, has many faces, and sometimes even those who kill in secret are crowned in gold. Castel Sant'Angelo looms above the Tiber River like a sentinel from another age, first a mausoleum, then a fortress, then a papal stronghold. Most know it for its towering ramparts and the long fortified corridor, the Passetto di Borgo, that connects it to the Vatican. But buried beneath its layered foundations is a chamber few speak of a papal crypt that officially doesn't exist. According to Vatican tour guides, the popes who used Castel Sant'Angelo as a refuge during sieges and uprisings left behind art, armories, and archives. Yet, 19th century renovations unearthed something else. A sealed stone stairway leading down to an unlit vault, lined with shallow niches. No names, no inscriptions. Only faded papal symbols carved into the walls, and in one corner a rusted censer and remnants of ecclesiastical garments. The discovery was quietly removed from public records, and the chamber resealed within weeks. But not before a Jesuit historian, Father Michel Arduini, sketched its interior and recorded what he believed it was: a burial site for those the Vatican could not bury publicly. Arduini's notes referenced at least 6 unnamed individuals, possibly former clergy, who had died under mysterious or politically sensitive circumstances, whose graves would have raised too many questions. He believed this crypt was created not out of reverence, but necessity. The Church had always buried its saints in splendor, but for those it needed to forget, it offered only silence and stone. One letter from the era hints at a chamber of dismissal used by the Papal Guard, possibly linked to executions carried out without trial. No records confirm this, and the Vatican has never acknowledged the existence of such a crypt. But Castel Sant'Angelo has always been more than a fortress. It is where popes fled, ruled, and sometimes made decisions in the absence of law. If the chamber exists, it is not a tomb of honor. It is a vault of disavowal. And the souls resting there, if they rest at all, are remembered not with prayers but with absence. In the late 17th century, amid the shifting allegiances of European courts and the quiet rise of Protestant influence, the Vatican turned not only to priests and diplomats for intelligence, but occasionally to those most overlooked. Sister Agnese di Spoleto was one such figure. Cloistered at the convent of Santa Maria del Rose, she was known publicly as a healer, a scribe, and a woman of austere piety. But within certain corridors of the Vatican, she was referred to by another name, La Voce Bianca, the White Voice. Agnese came from noble blood, educated in Latin, Greek, and theology before taking vows. Her skill in correspondence and discretion made her the ideal candidate for a quiet, dangerous mission. Embedded within her cloister were letters from French and Austrian emissarias coded, sewn into bindings, hidden behind false panels and icons, carried under the pretext of relic exchange. She passed on intelligence regarding political movements, heretical writings, and the whisperings of bishops whose loyalties were in question. All this, from behind the walls of a convent the world assumed was devoted to nothing but prayer. But the strain of secrecy took its toll. In 1693, a fire broke out in the convent under suspicious circumstances. Several sisters perished. Agnese was not among the dead, but she was never seen again. Her name vanished from church rolls. The Vatican issued no statement. Only years later did a letter surface in the Vatican archives, addressed to the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, acknowledging the quiet resolution of the Santa Maria affair and commending the service of the Silent Flower. Some believe she was relocated under a new name. Others whisper that she was silenced, not by enemies of the Church, but by the Church itself, too valuable to leave exposed, too dangerous to leave free. Her story is not told in hagiographies, but in a dusty corner of the archives, one page remains. Her script, careful and clean, beneath a symbol used only for internal operations. Not all saints wear halos, and not all martyrs die in public. In the intricate lattice of Europe's monarchies, power often wore a crown-butt absolution, wore a collar. For centuries, popes entrusted their most delicate political influence to the Society of Jesus, whose members served not only as missionaries and scholars, but as confessors to the rulers of Christendom. One such man was Father Lorenzo Bartoli, a Jesuit whose name was rarely spoken aloud, but whose counsel shaped the consciences of kings. Appointed as spiritual advisor to both Philip IV of Spain and later Louis XIII of France, Bartoli's presence was subtle, his voice soft, but what he knew was priceless. Behind velvet doors, he heard the secrets of war, betrayal, heresy, and hidden affairs. Monarchs poured out what they dared not say even to their ministers. And what Bartoli confessed back to Romine cryptid in private letters, hand-delivered by trusted couriers, became the lifeblood of Vatican diplomacy. It is said that Bartoli once dissuaded a Spanish king from declaring war on Naples after revealing that the Pope already knew of the plot. Another rumor tells of a French courtier who sought to blackmail a bishop, only to vanish days after Bartoli heard the bishop's confession. Officially, the Jesuit never wielded political power. He wrote no decrees, issued no public statements. Yet his influence echoed in treaties, cardinal appointments, and sudden shifts of policy across Europe. Some feared him, others revered him. But even within the Jesuit order, few knew the extent of his reach. When Bartoli died in 1643, his body was interred without fanfare. No eulogy, no monument. Only a sealed scroll was placed within his coffinet's contents, still classified by the Vatican to this day. Some believe it contains a record of the king's confessions. Others believe it was his own. What remains clear is this: Bartoli did not carry a blade, nor command an army. His weapon was silence, his power trust, and through whispered absolution he became the unseen hand that steered thrones and shielded a church that never stopped listening. In the labyrinthine archives beneath the Vatican, where countless documents are stored and forgotten, there is whispered talk of a manuscript so dangerous that its existence was denied for centuries. Known only as the Liber Umbrae, or Book of Shadows, it was said to contain detailed accounts of secret missions, covert assassinations, and political manipulations conducted under papal orders. According to the scant references that survive, the manuscript was penned in the late 16th century by an anonymous scribe close to the papal court. It allegedly included names of cardinals, diplomats, and operatives who participated in killings designed to protect the church's interests. For generations, the Liber Umbrae was locked away in a heavily guarded chamber, accessible only to a select few within the Curia. However, in 1906, during a reorganization of the archives, fragments of the manuscript were reportedly discovered by an archivist named Father Paolo Rossi. Father Rossi tried to alert church authorities to the implications of the find, but his warnings were met with silence and veiled threats. His diary, smuggled out before he disappeared from public view, described the manuscript as a poison that could unravel centuries of carefully woven silence. Subsequent investigations into Father Rossi's fate remain inconclusive, and the manuscript itself vanished once again. Historians and conspiracy theorists alike debate its authenticity, but the fragments that have surfaced suggest a church deeply involved in real politic beyond prayer and doctrine. If the Liber Umbrae ever resurfaces, it would challenge not only the narrative of sanctity, but expose the lengths to which the papacy went to safeguard its power. The Vatican denies the manuscript's existence, but its shadow still haunts the corridors of power, a reminder that some secrets are written in ink darker than black. In a dimly lit chamber somewhere in Renaissance Rome, a man named Paolo Orsini sat alone, trembling before a candle's flicker. Once a nobleman turned servant of the papacy's most clandestine missions, Orsini had lived a life shrouded in silence and blood. But now, imprisoned and broken, He was ready to speak a confession that would send tremors through the highest halls of the Vatican. Born into the infamous Orsini family, Paolo was trained from youth in the arts of subterfuge and assassination, skills his family wielded as power brokers within Rome. But his greatest employer was not his kin, but the papacy itself. His assignments were whispered about but never recorded, eliminating dissenting cardinals, poisoning foreign emissaries, and silencing inconvenient witnesses. His methods were cold, precise, and deadly. Yet it was one mission that shattered him, the poisoning of a French ambassador who had come too close to uncovering illicit Vatican dealings in 1535. The poison was slow-acting, agonizing. Orsini watched the man suffer for weeks. Guilt consumed him, and when he was finally caught, the Church faced a dilemma. A public trial would expose secrets and betray alliances. So instead, Orsini was locked away in secret, his confessions demanded only by a select inquisitor. His testimony, sealed and buried, detailed not just crimes but named popes, cardinals, and officials who ordered the killings. When the Church refused to act, Orsini threatened to reveal all. In response, his voice was silenced forever. Historians discovered fragments of his confession centuries later, hidden in coded Vatican correspondence. The full transcript remains lost, but the partial records confirm a chilling truth. The papacy did not merely tolerate assassins, it commanded them. Orsini's confession remains a testament to the dark bargains made in the name of faith, a warning that beneath the prayers, the Church sometimes spoke only in whispers of death. Beneath the Vatican's towering walls and sprawling gardens, hidden from the eyes of pilgrims and diplomats alike, lies a network of passageways known only to a few. These secret corridors, some dating back to the Middle Ages, were constructed to allow the Pope and his closest confidants to move unseen through the city and escape danger. But beyond mere escape routes, these passages became avenues of influence and intrigue, channels through which power could be wielded in silence. One such passage, the famed Passetto di Borgo, connects the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo and has been used in times of siege and conspiracy. Yet there were other, lesser-known tunnels within the Vatican itself, accessible only through hidden doors in private chambers or beneath the libraries. According to accounts from the 16th century, cardinals and influential courtiers used these passages to meet clandestinely, bypassing formal audiences and avoiding prying ears. Political negotiations, whispered threats, and the exchange of bribes often took place in these shadowed halls. Moreover, these secret routes enabled discreet movement of personnel guards, messengers, even assassins. A report from a disgraced Vatican scribe from 1589 details the use of these tunnels to escort unsanctioned guests out of the city, avoiding public scandal. The tunnel's labyrinthine design was such that few outsiders could navigate them, and many courtiers feared being trapped within. Their very existence allowed the papacy to maintain control, not just over public rituals, but over the hidden machinery of governance. In this subterranean world, power was physical as well as symbolic. The true seat of papal authority was not always found in grand halls, but in the silent footsteps echoing through secret stone corridor paths that led to influence, survival, and sometimes death. In the quiet cloisters of Renaissance Italy, where monks took vows of silence and lived lives devoted to prayer and study, there emerged a shadow that defied the sanctity of the walls. These were men and women who, beneath the habits of the devout, concealed identities forged in secrecy and trained in the art of death. The notion of a cloistered assassin seems contradictory, but records and whispered tales suggest that certain monastic orders were, at times, complicit in clandestine missions for the papacy. Among them was a secretive group loosely affiliated with the Camaldolese monks, who lived in isolated hermitages, yet were rumored to serve as operatives for the Vatican's more discreet needs. These individuals were chosen for their piety, discretion, and physical skill. Trained in martial arts, poisons, and disguise, they could move unnoticed in both court and countryside. Their assignments ranged from guarding papal secrets to eliminating threats deemed too dangerous for open confrontation. One particularly chilling account from 1530 tells of Brother Matteo, a monk who infiltrated a group of mercenaries hired to assassinate a cardinal sympathetic to Protestant reformers. Matteo's intervention was swift and silent. The mercenaries were found dead, and the cardinal's life was spared, but no official investigation followed. Such stories were rarely recorded and almost never acknowledged. The Church publicly condemned violence, but tolerated these shadowy protectors. They were cloaked in habit, sworn to silence, and erased from history if discovered. Their existence challenges the simple image of monastic peace. Within the silence of the cloister, faith and violence intertwined, making the cloistered assassin a paradox, a servant of God who wielded death in his name. Buried deep beneath the Vatican library lies a chamber that few have ever entered, and fewer still have documented. Known among a secretive few as the Archivum Occultum, or the Hidden Archives, this vault is said to contain the records of the Church's most covert operations documents, detailing espionage, covert diplomacy, and, most notably, the missions that blurred the line between holy duty and political assassination. Officially, the Vatican maintains that all sensitive documents are catalogued and accessible for scholarly research, yet the Archivum Occultum is sealed with multiple locks, both physical and bureaucratic, requiring direct papal authorization for access. Over the centuries, rumors of its contents have spread among historians and conspiracy theorists alike. Whispers speak of letters between popes and shadowy agents, lists of targets considered threats to the faith, and coded instructions sent to operatives across Europe and beyond. In the early 18th century, a disgraced archivist named Paolo Ferrara attempted to steal portions of these documents, only to disappear under mysterious circumstances shortly after. His notes, found years later in a hidden compartment, describe encountering manuscripts with chilling precision names, dates, and outcomes of missions never mentioned in public records. The vault reportedly holds records from the Inquisition's darkest days, the political intrigues of the Renaissance, and even correspondence related to the Counter-Reformation's secret wars. Though sealed, its existence implies that the Church's history includes deeds deliberately kept from the light. For centuries, the Vatican has protected this trove not only to safeguard secrets, but to preserve the image of the Church. Yet the shadows of these archives hint at a Church not only of prayer but of power, where faith and force have long intertwined behind closed doors. Throughout the turbulent centuries of European history, the papacy was often more than a spiritual authority. It was a political powerhouse, engaged in the complex web of alliances, betrayals, and wars that shaped nations. Unable to wield armies directly for much of its history, the Church frequently relied on proxy forces to achieve its aims. These were wars fought not by papal soldiers in armor, but through sponsored factions, mercenaries, and even secret operatives who carried out violent missions on behalf of the Vatican's interests. One notable example lies in the Italian wars of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, where successive popes navigated shifting alliances between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Popes like Julius II and Leo X financed and incited conflict not only to protect the papal states, but to assert influence over rival powers. Behind the scenes, agents facilitated assassinations, sabotage, and political subterfuge. Letters recovered from diplomatic archives reveal payments to condottiere mercenary leaders tasked with disrupting enemy supply lines and eliminating key figures loyal to opposing crowns. The Vatican's role was rarely publicized. Instead, it maintained a facade of neutrality or spiritual oversight. Yet, in the shadows, it was a master strategist. These proxy wars extended beyond Italy. In the Balkans and Central Europe, papal support for Catholic forces during the Reformation often translated into covert operations, espionage, and targeted killings aimed at suppressing Protestant influence. The Church's hand was rarely visible, but its reach was vast. Proxy wars allowed the papacy to engage in realpolitik while preserving its sacred image, turning distant battlefields into arenas where faith and power collided silently but fiercely. The legacy of these conflicts remains a reminder that the Vatican's influence was as much forged in diplomacy and intrigue as in doctrine and prayer. The confessional booth, a sacred space where the penitent reveals sins and receives absolution, is often seen as a symbol of mercy and spiritual cleansing. Yet within the walls of the Vatican, this intimate chamber also became a strategic instrument for control and influence. Throughout the Renaissance and into the Baroque period, popes and cardinals recognized the confessional's potential beyond its spiritual function. Powerful figures, monarchs, nobles, and even rival clergy often confessed their darkest secrets to priests who wielded their silence as a currency. The confessor, sworn to secrecy under the seal of the sacrament, became an inadvertent keeper of political secrets, moral compromises, and dangerous alliances. Some confessors, knowingly or not, became pawns or players in the grand game of power. They could manipulate, threaten, or persuade penitents by exploiting knowledge no one else possessed. In several documented cases, popes appointed trusted priests as personal confessors to kings and queens, ensuring the Vatican had insight into state affairs that no ambassador could obtain. This knowledge shaped diplomatic decisions, appointments of bishops, and the suppression of heresy. The confessional's walls held conversations that would decide wars, marriages, and fates. However, this power was double-edged. If a confessor disclosed secrets, even subtly, it could lead to blackmail or elimination. The trust was absolute but fragile. One notorious case involves the confessor of King Henry IV of France, who allegedly leaked political information to the Vatican, influencing the fragile Catholic Huguenot peace. Over time, the confessional evolved from a spiritual sanctuary into a vault of secrets, making it both a refuge and a weapon. It exemplified how the Church's sacred rites could also serve the temporal ambitions of those who claimed divine authority. In the early 18th century, Vatican diplomacy was a complex game of shadows and subtleties, as the Papacy sought to maintain influence across the shifting alliances of European courts. One of its most skilled envoys was Monsignor Carlo Bellini, a diplomat known for his linguistic prowess and intimate knowledge of court intrigues. Sent to Vienna in 1712 to negotiate peace and gather intelligence on the Habsburg Empire's plans, Bellini quickly became indispensable to the Holy See. However, less than a year into his mission, Bellini vanished without a trace. His last dispatch, intercepted by Venetian agents, hinted at uncovering a plot involving high-ranking Austrian officials and the possible betrayal of church interests. Despite extensive searches and diplomatic pressure, no sign of Bellini emerged. Official reports claimed he had returned to Rome, but Vatican records lacked any confirmation. Rumors swirled of his abduction, assassination, or secret arrest, but no evidence surfaced. Some suspected involvement by rival powers keen to silence him. Others believed that factions within the Vatican viewed his knowledge as dangerous and arranged his removal. Decades later, a letter from an anonymous source suggested Bellini had been imprisoned in a hidden cell beneath the Hofburg Palace, but the claim remains unverified. His disappearance left a void in Vatican diplomacy and sent a clear message to those who dared to tread too close to secrets best kept in silence. Monsignor Bellini's fate remains one of the most enduring mysteries of papal espionage. Stark reminder that even those who serve the Church's cause may become its casualties. The Church's clandestine agents operated under rules written not on parchment, but passed down in whispered traditiona code that balanced duty, discretion, and deadly precision. While the existence of papal assassins has long been debated, accounts from various eras reveal the presence of operatives trained to eliminate threats discreetly and efficiently. These agents adhered to a strict set of principles designed to protect both the mission and the institution. Foremost among these was secrecy. Any operation was to be concealed not only from the public, but often from even the highest ranks within the Church. The assassin was not to act on personal vendettas or for gain, but strictly under orders issued directly or indirectly by the Pope or his closest advisors. Another principle was proportionality. Targets were chosen carefully, with a preference for swift, painless methods to avoid scandal and martyrdom. The use of poisons, staged accidents, and silent weapons were common. Operatives were trained to blend into their environments, adopting new identities and leaving no trace. Importantly, the code emphasized loyalty and sacrifice. Failure or betrayal meant death, and silence was absolute, enforced by oaths stronger than any earthly law. A surviving fragment of an oath taken by one such agent from the 17th century reads, "I serve the keys, unseen and unheard. My hand is swift, my tongue sealed. For the Church, I give all." This code ensured that papal assassins were not rogue killers, but disciplined servants of an institution that prioritized survival through shadow as much as through light. The moral ambiguity of their work remains a topic of debate, but within their ranks, the code was Law's thin line between sinner and servant. In a dimly lit cell deep within the Vatican's labyrinthine dungeons, a man named Marco Galli awaited his final moments. Once the official executioner of the Papal States, Galli was both feared and Shuneda, necessary instrument of justice, whose hands were stained with the blood of heretics, conspirators, and traitors. Yet in the weeks leading to his death in 1691, Galli recorded a confession unlike any before it. In this secret testimony, he revealed that many of his executions were not ordered through proper judicial channels, but came from anonymous instructions, signed only with the papal seal or sometimes no signature at all. He described nights when prisoners disappeared before trial, only to be handed over to him in shadowed corridors, their charges never heard, their pleas unheard. He recounted instances where innocent men and women were condemned to silence political dissent or settle scores within the Curia. Galli's confession named cardinals who bypassed courts and popes, who granted mercy to allies while condemning rivals. The document, smuggled out by a sympathetic priest, was buried in the archives and only surfaced centuries later. His words painted a portrait of a church that wielded execution as a tool of control as much as of justice. Galli himself expressed deep remorse, calling his role a curse upon the holy name. The confession became a stark reminder that beneath the rituals and sermons, the machinery of death often operated in secrecy-deciding who lived and who died, not on the basis of sin, but of power. Marco Galli died with a soul burdened by the weight of unspoken truths, leaving behind a legacy both dark and indispensable to the papal court. As the 19th century dawned, the Church faced challenges unlike any before. The rise of secular states, revolutionary ideas, and calls for transparency that threatened centuries of carefully guarded secrecy. Yet within the Vatican, a final profound secret was said to endurion that encapsulated the paradox of power and faith. This secret was not a plot, an assassination, or a hidden archive, but a pact. According to whispered accounts preserved in the diaries of a cardinal who later defected, the Pope and his closest advisors forged an unspoken agreement with certain European monarchies to maintain mutual silence about the Church's covert activities, including its use of assassins and espionage. This pact ensured that political rivals would not expose the Church's darker deeds, while the Vatican pledged to support the sovereign's rule through spiritual authority and clandestine influence. The arrangement was as fragile as it was essential, maintained through delicate diplomacy, coded correspondence, and sometimes even the sacrifice of individuals who knew too much. In exchange, the Church preserved its position as a global power, steering the course of history from behind a veil. When questions about these clandestine actions arose publicly, they were met with denials, obfuscations, or ecclesiastical silence. And so, this last secret became the foundation upon which the modern Holy See balanced faith and realpolitik. It was a reminder that beneath the rituals, beneath the prayers, the Church was as human as any institution willing to wield shadows to protect its light. Today, while the Vatican has embraced transparency in many areas, this last secret remains locked away, known only to those who sit closest to the throne, a quiet testament to the enduring complexity of power and belief.